Hello and welcome back to another video. So in this video I'm going to be reviewing Fractal Design's latest case, the Meshify 2. So I've already put a full build guide together to building in this case, so if you haven't seen that video I'll put a link to it in the description so you can check it out. So the Meshify 2 isn't a completely new case, it's really a modernisation of an existing case. So the Meshify 2 comes in two different sizes. There's this standard size, which I have, but there's also an XL, slightly larger version available as well. I only have the standard size, so I'm going to focus on that in this particular review. So the Meshify 2, the standard version, is currently on sale in the UK for about £130, whereas the XL version is £35 dearer at around about £165. So the case is available in black and white. With white you really only have one option. There's a clear tempered glass panel, whereas with the black version there's three different options. So you can have a solid side panel, a tempered glass panel with a light tint, or a tempered glass panel with a dark tint. I went for the one with the light tint. Obviously I've taken it off because all you will see is reflection if I left it on now, but I'm very happy with the light tint on the tempered glass panel that I got. So this is a reasonably large case at 59 litres, but you can fit a fair amount of hardware into it. So the case supports motherboards all the way up to E80X in size. We can fit power supplies up to 250mm in length, CPU coolers up to a maximum height of 185mm, and we can fit long graphics cards up to a maximum length of 491mm. There's lots of support for radiators in this case. Up top we can fit a 420mm radiator or AIO. In the front it's up to a 320mm, down at the bottom a 280mm, and at the rear a 120mm. The case can support a maximum of 9 140mm fans. That's 3 at the front, 3 at the top, 1 at the rear, and 2 down the bottom where the hard drive cage and power supply are. And the hard drive cage does need to be removed to fit those 2 fans in. The case comes with 3 fans included, and they are all black fans, the Dynamic X2 GP14. Removing the side panels is a fairly simple matter. There's a little catch on the rear. It's just pulled forward and you can lift the panels off. The locking mechanism feels fairly secure, and the panels, there's a nice weight to them. Once the rear panel is removed, there is an additional plastic cable cover down at the bottom where the hard drive cage and power supply go that needs to be removed. To remove it, you simply pull it backwards to unlock the clips, and then it can simply be lifted upwards. The front mesh of the case is on hinges, and the door can be opened by pulling on the Fractal logo. It is important to note that the door doesn't open all the way, but that's not a problem because it can be removed from the hinges by pulling it forward. When you've got the front mesh panel off, you'll notice it's actually 2 parts. There's the mesh, but there's also a dust filter beneath it. And the dust filter can be removed by simply pulling upwards. So this is a nice option that Fractal are offering you. There's a lot of the cases now are just mesh with no filter. And I'm generally fairly happy with these, but there are a lot of people who have concerns about dust in the case. So Fractal are giving you the best of both worlds here. If you want just mesh at the front for maximum airflow, you can leave the dust filter out. But if you're somebody who prefers a case without any dust in it, you have the option for both of these panels at the front. With the front mesh panel removed, the rest of the front panel can be removed by simply pulling it forward. And this is again one of the nice features about this case compared to the previous version, and that is that the front I/O is now built into the case rather than attached to the front panel. So the front panel is easy to fully remove. While we're on the I/O, this case has 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports. There's a single USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type C port. We've got separate headphone and microphone jacks. There's a power and reset button as well. To remove the top panel, you just simply lift it upwards. Down below that, there's a dust filter, which is removed by pushing backwards and lifting up. And again, due to the design of the top panel with its incorporated mesh, the dust filter below is optional. So again, you've got a choice. You can work with just the mesh on the top or mesh plus filter. With the dust filter removed, we can see the removable radiator and fan bracket at the top of the case. It's held on with 2 screws at the front, which once they're removed, the bracket can simply be lifted up. And this again is a really useful design feature given the space at the top of this case is quite tight. Up the top of the case as well, you'll notice that there's space for a fill port. The third dust filter in this case is down the bottom, and it can simply be removed at the front by pulling forward. Moving inside the case, down at the bottom right hand side, there's a two-part bracket which can be removed to allow radiators and fans to be mounted lower down at the front of the case. One of the nice things about this bracket is that it's in two parts, which means if you're not putting radiators all the way into this large potential space, you can put part of the bracket on and cover the unsightly mess of cables that would otherwise be shown at the bottom of the case. And this is somewhere I've criticised other cases that I've reviewed before, because a lot of them, the bracket is either on or off. And maybe this says more about my bad cable management than anything else, but with the bracket all the way off, quite often you can see a mess of cables down the bottom of the case. And this was a really nice feature, being able to put part of the bracket back on. I wasn't actually able to see any of the cables at the bottom of the case. And I did a number of different configurations with this build, with a radiator and fans at the front, and just with fans at the front. And either way, having part of the bracket on looked really tidy. Another option that's included with this case is a dedicated 2-slot vertical GPU mount. It is important to mention that the riser cable and additional hardware to secure the riser cable that you're going to need to use this slot isn't included as standard, and it's going to have to be purchased from Fractal as an option. If you're thinking of doing this, I would issue a word of caution. This bracket looks fairly close to the front tempered glass panel, and any card you put into it I think is fairly likely to overheat. I haven't tested it in this case, but in another case, having a card mounted so close to the front tempered glass panel resulted in really high temperatures under load. And in fact, when I moved the same card, keeping it in vertical orientation but further back into the case, temperatures came down by 19 degrees. So if you've got an air-cooled card, I wouldn't recommend using this bracket. I think it's fine for a water-cooled card, but not for an air-cooled card. At the rear of the case, we've got a bracket for the power supply, which is held on with 2 thumb screws. And again, this makes it possible to mount your power supply directly in from the rear of the case, making things a little bit easier. Moving into the rear compartment, we shouldn't have any issues with cable management. There's lots of Velcro cable ties. We've got lots of cable channels down the middle of the case, and there's also lots of further places where we can secure cables using the included cable ties. All the cable cutouts look to be in sensible locations, and it's nice to see that they've got rubber grommets around them all. Another really nice feature of this case is the included fan hub, which will support up to a maximum of 9 fans, which is great because this case has 9 fan mounting locations. It is important to mention that 3 of the connections on the fan hub are for 4-pin fans and 6 of them are for 3-pin fans. Likewise, it's important to mention that the 3 included fans which come with this case have a 3-pin connection on them. In this compartment as well, you'll find 2 SSD brackets for 2.5-inch drives, and again these can be mounted at the back where they're currently shown, or they can be moved into the front of the case and put on display. Down at the bottom of the case you'll note the hard drive cage, which can accommodate up to 2 drive trays. The position of this hard drive cage is movable down this bottom compartment. To do so, all you need to loosen the 4 screws which hold it in at the bottom of the case, and then it can simply be slid from left to right, tightening up the screws again to secure it in its new location. If you prefer, you can of course fully loosen the screws and then remove the hard drive cage. Just above the hard drive cage, you'll notice there's a multi-bracket. This is designed to mount another drive, or equally you can mount a reservoir or pump on this bracket. One of these brackets is included with the case, although you can purchase additional ones from Fractal. If you're somebody who needs more storage than this, you can convert the case from what is currently in an open mode into what Fractal describe as storage mode. To do this, you want to loosen 5 screws from the rear panel where you'll find the multi-bracket attached. You can then move this panel to the front of the case. In doing so, you're then going to be able to mount the hard drive trays to the back of this panel. And this panel can accommodate up to 9 hard drive trays. You're going to find 4 of them in the optional accessory box and 2 of them in the hard drive cage. The bracket itself can accommodate up to a maximum of 9, and obviously you can purchase additional ones from Fractal if you want to fill out this bracket. Okay, so that's the main case features, and I want to give you a closer look at my build.
Lightning strikes by my window, hits my chest right in the morning, like a warning. Could have slept here for days. I felt your heartbeat, felt your mouth breathe, but it's not real. We were close to see the sun, but clouds got in our way, and so
Okay, so this brings me on to some of the things I liked about the case. The first thing I really liked about the case was the look of it. I think it's a great looking case, and I think a large part of that is due to the very distinctive front mesh panel. One of the things you mightn't realise by looking at, but there is a white, quite a long white power LED on the front of it. And because the theme of most of my builds, I tend to set all my RGB to white, this fitted in really well with my build. So it's a positive for me. But if you're somebody who tends to go for a different colour and a different theme, this white light at the front might look quite out of place for you. So that is important. That's something to factor in. A lot of other case manufacturers will allow you to adjust this using an ARGB header or a case controller button. It's fairly subtle, not a big problem for me, but again, it could be a big issue for you. So that's why I'm going to mention it. Looking at the tempered glass panel, I went for the one with the light tint on it, and I think it looks absolutely perfect. I don't have a whole lot of light in the case. There's really only the light coming from the fans at the top, the RAM and the graphics card, but the light tint looked very well. I've had other cases with a dark tint and you can't actually see anything that's inside it, so I would recommend the light tint. Probably one of the main things I liked about this case was the build quality. From the very first moment when you're taking the panels on and off, you can tell this is a well put together case. It's well thought out. The panels come off, they feel sturdy, and the mechanisms for securing them feel robust and reliable. It may seem a silly thing to mention, but actually the feet on the case are of good quality. I build most of my cases on a white table, and you would be surprised the number of times during recording my builds I'm having to take the case off, polish the black marks that have come off on the bottom of my table. And with my previous case, I actually had to put little rubber pads on the feet of the case to stop it marking my new desk. So there's no issues at all with this. Should be a simple and a standard thing, but you'd be surprised the number of cases out there that will either scratch or mark your desk. This is no problem at all for this case. One of the other things I really liked was the top mesh panel. It's a really easy thing that other case manufacturers get wrong. They include a separate dust filter, which is maybe a magnetic connection. Some of them don't look well, they ruffle up, you can see the edges. The fact that you've got one piece of mesh at the top and the filter down below it, I think looks really good. While I'm praising the build quality, it wasn't all perfect. I did have a few screws that were over tightened. There was one screw that I couldn't get out at all, and actually I ended up damaging the threads trying to loosen it and had to drill it out. That has happened with other cases, and that can just be bad luck. But apart from that, the build quality was excellent. Okay, other things I really liked about the case are really a lot of the things I've already talked about in the first section. I love the fact that it comes with a fan hub. I love the fact that it comes with 3 fairly good quality fans included. And again, I like a lot of the neat features. I like the bracket at the back for mounting a power supply, the little bracket at the front which splits into 2 pieces. As I've mentioned, I wish other cases would do this, because that big horrible hole that you get in the case if you need to remove the bracket and can't put it back on does not look great. Other things I really liked about this case were at the back of the case. Cable management was really easy in this case. I think it's probably one of the easiest cases I've had to manage cables in. And again, I had no trouble at all getting the panels back on with all the cables there. A lot of the other cases, there's a fair bit of pressure on the panels because certainly cable management isn't one of my strengths. Another thing I really like about the case is the options you have with it. It's nice to be able to convert it from its open mode to a storage mode if that was something you wanted to do. And it's good that Fractal included an additional 4 drive cages in the accessory box, allowing you to actually do that without going back to them to purchase more parts. I like the way they've dealt with the dust filters, in that the dust filters at the front and at the top are removable, given by the way there's a 2-layer design with mesh outside the dust filters. Other cases you can't really do that. For example, some of the other airflow orientated cases, they just don't make an option for a dust filter at the front, and again that's going to annoy some people. Equally at the top, the dust filter is actually something magnetic which attaches to the top of the case. Maybe doesn't look very good, but you can't actually take it off even if you're going to use the top as an exhaust, because then you're just left with a large hole. So the dust filter at the top of a lot of other cases actually acts as a top plus filter. So the way they've designed it with mesh and filter, they're giving you a choice in this case, which is great, and I wish other case manufacturers would do something similar. Okay, so this brings me on to some of the things I didn't like about the case. And I suppose the first thing was that space at the top of the case was quite limited. Although the case is quite long this way, it's quite small this way. And actually my Lancool II was taller than it, despite the fact I can fit much more hardware in this case than I can in the Lancool II. Again, Fractal have thought about this and they've made the bracket at the top removable. So again, while I'm putting this down as a slight negative, I don't know if it really is, given that you can actually fit an awful lot of hardware into a small space. So again, you could look at it as an advantage, but maybe if you're going to be building for the first time, certainly getting the cables from the fans in and access to the ports at the top of the motherboard can be that bit more difficult. So if you are going to be building in this, make sure you plug everything in at the top before you install fans or radiators in at the top of the case. One of the other things I didn't like, and I've complained about this before with other cases, particularly cases where you're not going to have fans down here, and that is the multicolored HD audio cable which plugs in down to the far left hand side of the case. Obviously you're going to have fans at the bottom, you're not going to see the cable, but in cases where there's not designed to have fans down here, when you look straight in, all you can see is that multicolored cable. And it would be a really simple fix to just have that as an all black cable. Obviously I can get a cable extension or put a little bit of insulating tape over it, but again, it's a very small thing that somebody can do at the manufacturing end to solve that problem. Another thing I wasn't particularly keen on was the fan mounting locations down at the bottom of the case. There is space for 2 140mm fans down there. And maybe this says more about my usual cable management than anything else, but normally down that space I like to leave all my cable extensions. The problem with that is, particularly when you had a radiator in the front, that your two fans were basically right up against the radiator at the front and right up against the power supply at the back. So you couldn't leave any cables at all down that bottom compartment. The only way I could actually manage this was to remove the cable extensions and then plug the cables from the power supply directly into the motherboard, because obviously I wanted to test the effects of the bottom fans on cooling. So that is something to factor in if you are planning on using those bottom fan mounting places. You probably would be better using the cables that come with your power supply or getting custom cables rather than custom cable extensions. The other thing was one of the fans at the bottom has that solid panel up above it. So a fan blowing up here into the solid panel, I can't really see it doing an awful lot of good. I can see the one over here doing a little bit of good, certainly for the half of the fan that's over next to it. But it was a bit of a questionable place for fan mounting locations. But we'll see that when we come on to the thermal testing. Did it actually make much of a difference or not? The final thing I didn't like about the case was the vertical GPU bracket. Obviously, if you're looking at air cooling, which I'm doing mostly with the graphics card, this is just a wasted feature in the case because you're not going to be able to use it. If you're using it for a custom water-cooled card, then it makes perfect sense to have the bracket included, and you'll probably think it's a really useful feature. So you can see really all the negatives aren't really true negatives, it just depends how you look at them. Okay, so now we come on to my build experience of building in this case, and in particular, is there anything I would do different if I was going to have to build in this case again? And really there was two main things. The first was whenever I started to build in this case, I plugged in black and white custom cable extensions for all the power supply cables, including the two additional ones over to the top left hand side of the motherboard for the CPU power. The problem was whenever I put my radiator and fans at the top, you could no longer see these custom cable extensions. So I was getting no benefit from them, but adding extra cables at the back of the case to have difficulty managing, and particularly when we talked about we were going to have to try fans at the bottom of the case to see their effects. So my advice to you, I think custom cable extensions look great and the black and white ones that I have used look good as well. But if you're going to use them just for the graphics card, use them just for the 24 pin, and leave out the custom cable extensions to the top left hand side of the motherboard for the CPU power. The second thing I would do differently at building again in this case, and I did cover this in my full build guide video, was when securing the radiator to the top removable bracket. It's important you secure it as far forward as possible. The first time I tried to do this, I had it slightly further back, and I couldn't slide the radiator all the way over to the left hand side because it was catching on the motherboard. With it in its most forward mounting place, I have no limitations on where the radiator can go at the front, so just be careful with that as well. And then a final thing to mention, if you are planning on mounting fans down the bottom of the case, I would make sure you don't use custom cable extensions. Either plan to use the cables that come with your power supply or get full custom cables. Okay, so this brings us on to the bit that everybody's interested in, the thermal testing. So before I come on to the results, I think it's important to explain how I do my thermal testing. So the first thing I do is I leave the computer idling in Windows with no programs running in the background. I leave it for 30 minutes and then I record the lowest CPU and GPU temperature over that 30-minute period. I then run an IDA64 stability test for 30 minutes with all components in the system being stressed, and record the maximum CPU and GPU temperature over that 30-minute period. Important to mention, ambient temperature is controlled to 20 degrees over that time period. I also record the average noise level over a 1-minute period, recorded at 30 centimeters away from the closed tempered glass panel, and I do that both at idle and at load. Okay, so let's come on and have a look at the results. Okay, so the first configuration I looked at was my stock build that I did in the build guide video. So that was the 360mm gallery. I had AIO at the top as exhaust. We used the 3 included case fans as front intake fans, and I added 1 Pure Wings to 140mm fan at the rear as exhaust. And I kept both dust filters in for this first test. So looking at the idle results, the CPU idled at a minimum of 41 degrees C, while the GPU idled at 31 degrees C. At idle, there was an average noise of 39 decibels. During the IDA64 stability test, the maximum CPU temperature was 88 degrees C, while the GPU went up to a maximum of 66 degrees C, and the average noise under load was 53 decibels. The next thing I wanted to do was see if removing the dust filters would make any difference to the temperatures and the noise. Obviously, as we have our radiator at the top as an exhaust, there's no need for a dust filter up there, particularly when we've got a mesh panel at the top. So that was the first thing I tried doing, was removing the dust filter at the top, but leaving the dust filter over the front intake. So we looked at the idle temperatures here first of all, so there was no difference to the CPU idle temperature at 41 degrees C, while with the top dust filter removed, the GPU idled 1 degree cooler at 30 degrees C. No difference in the noise at idle at 39 decibels. Under load, the maximum CPU temperature was actually 1 degree hotter at 89 degrees C compared to 88, while the GPU was 2 degrees hotter at 68 versus 66. Removing the top dust filter resulted in the noise dropping by 1 decibel down to 52 compared to 53 with both dust filters in place. Next, I wanted to test the effects of removing both the dust filters, so I went ahead and removed the front dust filter as well. So this time the CPU idled 1 degree hotter at 42 degrees C compared to 41, while there was no difference in the GPU temperatures compared to having both dust filters in place. Having both dust filters removed was associated with 1 decibel of extra noise at idle. During the IDA64 stability test, both the CPU and GPU reached a maximum temperature 1 degree hotter, with the CPU reaching 89 degrees C and the GPU 67 degrees C, compared to having both dust filters in place. Removing both the dust filters was associated with 1 decibel of less noise. So this first lot of tests were quite confusing. We went ahead and removed dust filters and ended up with worse temperatures. So how do I explain these? And I think the only way to explain these is the differences in the temperatures and the noise are within the margin of error in these tests. And I think really all that I can conclude is that the dust filters in this case are actually fairly good and they don't significantly affect the temperatures. And I don't truly believe that taking dust filters out will heat this PC up any more than having them in, and I think it's just within the margin of error for doing these tests. Next thing I wanted to do was test and see if removing the front panel as well as both the dust filters would make any difference to the temperatures. Again, I'm not recommending you do this, but it's a standard test I do when I'm testing out a PC. What I'm interested in is how restrictive is the front panel on the case. And one way of doing it is testing it both with and without the front panel. Again, I don't recommend you do this because you'll end up with a case full of dust. And the only reason to do this is to give you guys the answer to this question. So removing the front mesh panel, we got fairly consistent results here with both the CPU and GPU temperatures dropping by 1 degree, both at idle and at load. Noise levels were a similar story with a very consistent rise of 1 decibel, both at idle and load with removing the front mesh panel. Okay, so this result tells us that the front panel on this case is excellent and it's very unrestrictive to airflow. From my previous testing, I've found maybe 1 to 2 degrees of a difference with the front panel off is excellent, whereas a bad case will maybe have 8 to 10 degrees of difference with removing the front panel. So the front panel in this case is excellent. The next thing I wanted to test was the effect of occupying all the case fan locations in this case. So I kept the build the same as what we've previously tested, but added in an additional 2 140mm Pure Wings 2 fans down the bottom of the case as intake. Importantly, for the rest of these tests, I left the dust filters off. So the additional 2 140mm fans down the bottom of the case as intake. At idle, the CPU temperatures came down by 2 degrees to 40 from 42, and the GPU temperature came down by 1 degree from 31 to 30 degrees. This wasn't associated with any additional noise at idle. During the 30-minute IDA64 stability test, the maximum CPU temperature came down by 2 degrees to 87 from 89 degrees, and the GPU temperatures also fell by 2 degrees down to 65 from 67. This was, however, associated with 2 decibels of extra noise at load. Okay, so at first looks, it does seem having the 2 extra fans down the bottom are probably worth it, given the fact you reduce both your GPU and CPU temperatures by 2 degrees under load. The only downside to this is you're going to have a much tougher time, as we've mentioned, with cable management, because you're not going to be able to use that bottom section of the case. You're going to have to remove your hard drive cage, so if that was something you were wanting to use, you're not going to be able to. I don't think you're going to be able to use cable extensions with this, or if you do, you're going to have real trouble managing them in the compartment behind the case rather than using that area down the bottom. And also you're going to have the extra cost for 2 fans, and as well you're going to have 2 decibels of extra noise under load. So again, you're going to have to weigh that up. Is that 2 degrees saving under load worth it for all those downsides? Okay, the next thing I wanted to test was the effects of moving from the extreme of occupying all the case fans to managing with just the stock case fans. So as stock, this case comes with 2 140mm fans as intake at the front, at the top and at the middle at the front, and also you had one 140mm fan at the back as an exhaust. So I just to that added the radiator at the top as an exhaust configuration and compared that to my original build. Okay, so looking at the idle temperatures, this time the PC idled 3 degrees cooler at 39 degrees versus 42, and there was no difference to the GPU temperatures at idle. Having less fans was, however, associated with less noise at 38 decibels compared to 40 decibels under idle. During the IDA64 stability test, there was no difference to the CPU temperatures, while the GPU temperatures came down by 1 degree. This was associated with 1 decibel of extra noise. Okay, so how do we explain these results? We have actually taken some fans away and the temperatures have improved slightly, particularly at idle. And I think there's probably a few reasons for this. The first is sometimes more fans isn't better. Certainly it comes at more cost and more noise in general, adding more fans, but having more fans can actually alter the pattern of airflow through the case. It's sometimes a hard thing to understand, but actually altering that airflow, maybe creating turbulent flow in certain places, means that it's less efficient in moving air through the case. And the fact that Fractal shipped the case with the fans in a certain orientation, in general, they will have done a lot of testing and found that this was the optimal location for fans and maybe the right number of fans for the case. The other reason will become clear when I show you the results comparing the Fractal fans versus the PureWings 2. The Fractal fans perform better, and now having a Fractal fan at the back of the case versus a PureWings 2, this is quite an important fan for exhausting hot air, probably explained some of the difference in the temperatures. So I've already given you a spoiler for this next test. The next test was how good are the case fans, and what I wanted to do was compare the included case fans from Fractal with the PureWings 2 fans from BQuat. And I found the PureWings 2 fans from BQuat have actually performed reasonably well before. So how I did that was the last build which I had set up with just the 2 fans at the front, the 1 fan at the rear, and the AIO at the top as exhaust. I repeated that test, but instead of using the stock case fans, I replaced the fans at the front and the back with the BQuat PureWings 2. Looking at the temperatures, the Fractal fans were the clear winner, both at idle and under load. At idle, both the CPU and GPU idled 1 degree hotter with the BQuat fans compared to the Fractal fans. Under load, the CPU was 2 degrees hotter and the GPU 1 degree hotter with the BQuat fans, and there was no difference to the noise levels, both at idle and under load. Okay, so what can we conclude from this? Obviously, the BQuat PureWings 2 fans are a budget fan, and the included stock fans in the case cost twice as much, and that was the reason I went with the BQuat fans. Obviously, looking at the thermal results, it probably does make sense if you do want to add more fans to the case, you would match the stock case fans rather than going with the BQuat fans. Next thing I wanted to look at was the effects of moving the radiator to the front of the case and having it as an intake rather than exhaust. So I moved it to there and then obviously moved the stock case fans to the top and had them as an exhaust. So looking at the results here, with the radiator as a front intake, the CPU idled 4 degrees cooler and 38 degrees versus 42 degrees with the radiator as a top exhaust. No difference to the GPU temperatures, and the noise was significantly less by 3 decibels at 37 versus 40 with the radiator as a front intake. Looking at the temperature difference under load, again a significant difference here. Having the radiator as a front intake brought the maximum CPU temperature down by 5 degrees to 84 versus 89 degrees C. The GPU temperature was 1 degree hotter under load, and again that makes sense because rather than cool air coming in the front of the case, the air was going through the radiator before reaching the GPU. No difference in noise this time under load. Okay, so out of all the tests that I have done, this is the one that gives you the most significant difference in temperatures. And if you want to significantly reduce your CPU temperatures, the simplest thing you can do is have your radiator at the front as a front intake instead of at the top as an exhaust. And this just makes sense. Your radiator is receiving cool air from outside the case rather than hot air from the inside of the case. So you're going to cool the hot water coming through it down much more effectively with cool air than slightly warmed up air. It just makes sense. Okay, so given that it makes sense that having a radiator at the front as an intake is going to give you much better CPU temperatures than a top exhaust, your next question may well be, why did I create a build guide with a top mounted radiator as an exhaust? I think there's a few reasons for that. The first is there's more than one factor that comes into deciding about a component in a case. You're going to have to factor the thermals in, you're going to have to factor the noise in, but you're also going to have to factor in the aesthetics to the build as well. In this particular case, the radiator at the top looks much better. I've gone with a fairly dark build in the fact I've used the stock case fans, and having the fans at the top set to white creates a nice light into the build. Having the fans, when I installed the radiator at the front, I had the fans inside the case. You did still draw some light into the case, but it didn't look good. And you had the wrong side of the fans, because the fans were obviously intake, facing the inside of the case. So it definitely did not look as good inside the case. The other area it didn't look as good was at the front mesh panel, because you could definitely see the radiator through it, whereas looking through it and seeing the black fans moving, I think looks much better. So aesthetics was one of the big reasons. The other big important reason is I was making a build guide for others on how to do this, and it's become really topical at the moment to install your radiator with the tubes down at the bottom rather than having the tubes at the top. And the problem with this 360mm radiator is you cannot install it with the tubes down position. And I could not face another 100 comments of people telling me my radiator was up the wrong way. And if only I would turn my tubes down the bottom, all the noise that I was hearing in my build would disappear. But this obviously isn't the case. I'm going to play some noise samples for you in a minute, and it shows actually the noise at idle and at load, both with my radiator at the top and my radiator at the front in a tubes up position. Obviously this is a fairly new AIO, it's only a few months old, and over time the amount of water in it is going to go down and noise may become more of a problem. Okay, so what I'm really saying is there's lots of factors into deciding where your radiator goes. I think at the top it looks better, and you're going to avoid any issues with having a questionable radiator position, and this is certainly a very trendy thing at the moment. If you do want to install it as a front intake with tubes up, certainly I've never had problems with extra noise, and in fact these results show you're actually going to have less noise with that build. So it's what's most important to you, and what's one of the great things about building PCs is there's so many choices. My job is just to provide you with the results to let you make your own mind up and make your own decisions. Next thing I want to do was see, did occupying all the fan slots make a difference to the temperatures with the radiator at the front as an intake. So like I did with the last lot of tests, all I did was add 2 additional Pure Wings 140mm fans down to the bottom of the case set to intake. So this time at idle, the CPU was 1 degree cooler at 37 versus 38 degrees, no difference to the GPU temperature, staying at 31. But the additional 2 fans were associated with more noise at 39 decibels compared to 37 decibels at idle. Under load, the CPU temperatures actually increased to 85 versus 84 with the additional 2 fans, while the GPU temperatures were down 1 degree at 67 versus 68 degrees. Again, an extra decibel of noise at load with the 2 fans added in. Okay, so the results here are fairly clear. There's no benefit adding the additional 2 fans down the bottom of this case if you're going to install a 360mm radiator at the front as an intake. The last time with the radiator at the top, there was some benefit, but there was lots of downsides to the compromises you were going to have to make, losing your hard drive cage, not being able to use cable extensions without any difficulty, and the additional cost. This time, there's no benefits and lots of downsides. So if you're going to put a radiator at the front as an intake, leave the 2 fans out down the bottom. Next thing to test was the other extreme and trying to make do with the minimum amount of fans in the build. So we kept the I/O as a front intake and used just the 3 included case fans. So one of the things I've noticed in testing a lot of other builds, when you have a front intake and you run your hand over the top of the case, over the exhaust fans you can feel quite a lot of heat over the back, but when you come to just about here, there's almost no heat coming up through the exhaust fans. So it made sense when I had 3 case fans to put 1 in the middle, 1 at the back at the top, and then 1 at the rear, because that was going to be the locations where I was thinking from previous testing we were going to get the most benefit out of the 3 included case fans. Okay, so looking at the temperature difference of going back to just the stock case fans, at idle both the CPU and GPU were 1 degree hotter and there was 1 decibel of extra noise. It was a different story under load with both the CPU and GPU being 1 degree cooler and no difference to the noise levels. Okay, so again here the results are fairly conclusive and it is definitely a case of less is more. If you buy more fans, it's going to cost you more money and you're going to get no benefit from it. So if you are somebody who's going to go with a front mounted radiator, I would recommend you stick just with the stock case fans, putting 2 at the top in the middle and rear location and 1 at the rear of the case, all set to exhaust, and that's going to give you the best cooling in this case. Okay, so I'm going to show a summary slide of all the different test configurations, so you can go ahead and pause the video if you want to have a closer look at it. Okay, so to sum up the thermal results, my recommendation if you want to get the best cooling from this case would be the last configuration. So that is the front mounted radiator as an intake and just sticking with the 3 stock fans as exhaust. If you're somebody who doesn't want to mount your radiator in a front mounted location with the tubes up, you've got a few options. There's a few configurations I haven't tested, and certainly you could probably fit a 240 or a 280 radiator at the front in a tubes down position and still have it as a front intake. So if that's something that's really important to you, but you still want to get the best cooling from the case, you could probably do that. If you're somebody who cares more about the aesthetics of the build and you want to go with a top mounted radiator, my recommendation is probably sticking just with the stock case fans. And that's the configuration I've got in front of me at the moment. So it's the 2 stock case fans in their original locations, 2 at the front as intake and 1 at the back as rear, and just adding the radiator at the top. As the thermal testing has showed, adding the 2 additional fans down the bottom will give you better temperatures, but I think there's probably too many drawbacks. And like I say, if you're somebody who's into the aesthetics, you're probably going to want to use the cable extensions and you're just going to struggle to use them, and it's going to make the build process so much more difficult. So this is what I would go with if you're going to use the top radiator. So it turns out less is very definitely more in this case, and both the recommended configurations involve just the stock fans, which are fairly good, and either putting your radiator at the top or at the front, depending on what is most important for you. Okay, so I've given you a lot of thermal results for this case, but how does that compare to some of the other cases I've tested? And obviously using different hardware in each of the cases is going to affect the results. There is only one other case that I have thermally tested using the Galahad AIO, and that was the Lancool II. And I was able to find 2 very similar configurations where I had the radiator as a front intake and 3 additional case fans as exhaust. In this particular build, it was the stock Fractal case fans. In the Lancool II, I used the LL120 fans as exhaust fans. So I'll compare those results with you now. So looking at the results at idle, both the CPU and GPU idled hotter in the Meshify 2 compared to the Lancool II. It was 4 degrees of a difference with the CPU and 2 degrees difference with the GPU. And there was a fairly significant difference in the noise levels, 38 decibels versus 34 decibels in the Lancool II. Looking at the temperatures under load, it was a slightly different story here. The Meshify 2, the CPU was 1 degree cooler, while the GPU was also 1 degree cooler in the Meshify 2 as well. The Meshify 2 was again slightly noisier here by 1 decibel. Okay, so we need to interpret this last slide with a bit of caution, and the reason for that is there's more differences between the two builds than just the case. Although I used the same CPU and the same GPU in both the builds, the case fans were different and the motherboard was different, so it's not a like-by-like comparison. The reason I wanted to include it though was to give you a bit of a feel for where the Meshify 2 fits in. I think the results when it comes to thermals and noise are pretty good, but they're certainly not the best out there. And I think that's important to factor in if you're buying the case. Okay, so this brings me on to whether I recommend you go out and buy this case, particularly given the fact there's potentially other cases out there which cost less and are going to give you better thermals and better acoustics. And my answer to that is still yes, and that depends on what is most important to you. If budget is the most important thing to you, then probably this case is not the right one for you. There are much cheaper cases, for example the Lancool II and the PureBase 500DX, all cases that I've done significant thermal testing and build guides in, and they offer a lot of the same included features. They all offer included case fans which actually work fairly well. However, if you really like the look of this case, you're looking for a case that has exceptional build quality, and you're going to use the features that this case offers. For example, you're going to use the fan hub. You want a case that has a front panel USB-C connector without having to buy an additional cable, or maybe you're going to use the multitude of hard drive brackets that this case offers. Then paying that little bit extra for these features may be worth it for you. So yes, I am very happy with this case and I would recommend you go out and buy it if the additional price it costs over some of the other cases adds features that are going to be worth it to you. Okay, so hopefully you found this video useful, and if you have been thinking of getting this case, hopefully it's made things clearer for you. Do remember about that full build guide I have done in this case. If you're thinking of building in it, hopefully that will be useful to you as well. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. It's going to help me grow the channel and makes a real difference to me. Okay, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.